High School Massacre, more bombs are found tonight. And Chelsea get the Blues in their cup semi-final.
Television or on the internet. In Glasgow tonight we have the leaders of the four main political parties, rivals for power in the first Scottish Parliament for 300 years, which is going to be elected just 2 weeks from now. On our panel, Alex Salmond, who leads the Scottish National Party, Donald Dewar, Secretary of State for Scotland, Jim Wallace, who's chief of the Liberal Democratic clan, and David McCletchie, who leads the Scottish Tories. Okay, and our first question comes from Colin McClellan, who's a student.
Is the internet a greater threat to the American people than their gun laws?
Is the internet a greater threat to the American people than their gun laws? This is in the light of the terrible shooting in Denver, where it turns out that the two teenagers who'd done it not only had their own website, but also may have discovered how to make pipe bombs and the rest from the internet. Alex Salmond.
No, I think the gun laws are the bigger threat in America. I think, I mean, if you think of the tragedy that we've read about in today's papers, I think in any society, I mean, it's very easy to say America's a sick society, but in any society you're going to have sick people. And America is a much bigger society than most, therefore you'll have more incidents. And I think this is the 6th incident in America in the last 18 months. Not as terrible as this one, but nonetheless the 6th incident. But I think the question about gun laws is that when you've got these highly disturbed people, and clearly these people committed suicide and must have been very, very disturbed indeed, it's a question of the opportunity to commit carnage. And I think that opportunity is there if the gun laws are lax and they have easily available to them the weapons with which they can inflict this sort of suffering. So I think the gun laws are the real problem. And the internet, although it spreads information, some of which we wouldn't wish to be spread, is only a contributory factor.
What do you think?
Well, I think you're always going to get unbalanced people. And I'm not at all for censorship, but you always need people who read into things on the internet, or who see things, or who are going to get turned on by something. But the thing with, you always need people who are unbalanced, but to put guns in their hands, which is what the American Constitution does, is the most unbelievable thing.
But the bomb making, it's suggested, came from the internet, as with the bomb in Brixton this week, Combat 18. A thought to have made this pipe bomb, or whoever did it.
But then it's not a new thing. You're always going to have. It's not a new thing. The internet's a relatively new creation in our society. You're always going to. People are going to find a way, if they are that way inclined to make bombs. You can't blame the internet.
David McCletchie, what do you think?
Well, I certainly don't regard the internet as a greater threat to American citizens. Their gun laws certainly are, because there's, as I understand it, there are more guns than people in circulation in the United States. And their record on gun control in recent years has been quite abysmal. And it's something that I think has to be addressed very seriously in that country. So far as the internet is concerned, I do think we have to have a look at how sites are policed and the sort of information that is available and can be accessed, particularly by young people. But I'm not generally in favour of censorship, and I tend to agree with you that if someone wants to set their mind to that particular task, then they will find a way to do so.
The Duke of Edinburgh said in Korea, I think it was this week, that it was very unsafe to exploit technology without a thought for ethics or morality, and the internet was fantastic, but it's difficult to estimate the harm it can do when exploited by peddlers of pornography and other crooks. Jim Wallace.
I think it was Duke of Wellington who said too, if you educate people without religion, you make them clever little devils. And I think that is an important point to remember in terms of the internet. But can I share the consensus which we seem to have started off this evening with? I think the guns are the greater danger. You can get information on the internet, but in fact it's actually having the mechanism, the guns, to deliver the damage, which is the real danger. And I think unlike the United Kingdom, where guns are only permitted by license or by certificate, this concept, this notion in the States that everyone has a right to firearms, I think we've seen what that can lead to. But in terms of the internet, let's not forget the power of good for the internet. The people who want to clamp down on the internet and censor the internet tend to be totalitarian governments. And I think perhaps it's one of the great developments of the last years of the 20th century, that we actually can get truth into some countries where governments would otherwise try to suppress truth and information. And therefore the internet can be a great tool for good. But you know,
and a nail bomb in Brixton is a price you have to pay for that.
Well, I don't think that. I mean, there was plenty of cases, allegations in the past that you could go into libraries and pick books off the shelf and make bombs, and I don't think anyone suggested we ever should be closing libraries.
Donald, Dewar?
Yes, I find what happened in Denver, I find it frightening because it's totally irrational and inexplicable. I mean, there is no thought process that I can understand which would lead me to comprehend what was going through their minds and what they were doing. I greatly admire the freedom of American society, the liberalism in many ways, of many aspects of American life. Why, in fact, the right to carry a gun is part of that, just puzzles me greatly. But as you know, in American politics, anyone who attacks the gun lobby, anyone who stands in the way of the freedom to have guns on an unlimited and unrestricted basis is in deep political trouble. And I do hope that in time people will perhaps rethink that approach and rethink that morality. In Britain, I like to think that we have a liberal and free society, a tolerant society. But when we came to ban handguns after the tragedy at Dimbleby, there was really a consensus across the political divide, and I think throughout public opinion, some people understandably saw it as restrictive on a particular interest of theirs, and I understand that. But I think there was a consensus that we had to act.
But are you saying the politicians should act in the States, or the public opinion has to change first? Because you say quite rightly that the gun lobbies are very, very powerful and can destroy a political career if they choose to.
I think that politicians have to stand up to be counted on this, and I think if people led the way, then probably more and more would do so. But you've got to shift public opinion as well, or else the politicians squeak in the wilderness.
Man at the back there, please.
This issue about the internet is really just a smokescreen. As Jim Wallace says, you can buy books in the library, or you can hire a book out in the library in Glasgow, they're all on strike. But I mean, it's all about it's just a smokescreen to censor people and censor freedom of information. This country is one of the most secretive countries, at least in America. There's only one good thing in America. You've got a right to freedom of information. In this country, you go down to the city chambers in Glasgow, it's like drawing teeth trying to get information out of the local council. And Donald's laughing, it's his party that's in power.
Okay, I think the subject is changing smartly here. Hold on a second. They'll take the gentleman over there. Don't worry about the libraries, man. Yes, yes, sir.
Shouldn't the government and the industry in general be regulating information that is transferred across the internet somehow to try and stop this sort of thing happening in the future?
Do you think so?
Well, I think it's extremely difficult to do that technically, and I'm certainly against censorship. I mean, there'll be a very big argument where you start drawing the lines, and I would be concerned to some extent about that. Can I say that there's always been an ability to find out how to make weapons if you have that in your mind and that evil in your mind. Terrorism is not an invention of modern times, as we all know. And the gentleman up there, I hope he's going to strongly support the government's intention of bringing in a Freedom of Information Act, and you'll no doubt give us at least 2 cheers.
Glasgow, a Freedom of Information Council.
Well,
okay.
All
right, leave that for a minute. Let's just stick with the internet. Hold on. Let's just stick with the internet. We went on the internet this afternoon. We got instructions, which I've got here, on how to make a pipe bomb, a nail bomb, grenade, how to use nitroglycerin, how to make a fertilizer bomb, how to hotwire a car, how to burgle a house, how to tap a telephone, and how to make LSD. David. Now you're saying none of those things can be controlled.
I mean, and obviously it's deeply worrying.
I'm not going to pass
them to you. Yeah, okay, David. But I read. I'll verify the information. Yeah. I read just a few weeks ago, and I didn't check it out for obvious reasons, but I read in a scientific journal, a hard copy scientific journal, those instructions on how to make a nuclear device. Now, does that mean that scientific journals should be banned because that information, now it was in America as well, where they have, as Donald says, a Freedom of Information Act. Now, the trouble with censorship of the internet is very clear. Firstly, how do you do it exactly? Secondly, which government does it? Because the internet's a worldwide web, and therefore, are we saying that, for example, the Iraqi government should be censoring the internet in Iraq? I think if you started to censor the internet, then you would destroy the whole basis of the information revolution that we're living through. Now, I accept there are unfortunate consequences, but nonetheless, as Jim rightly says, we can't ban information, and you can't ban libraries just because some of the information is such that you don't want to get it into people's hands.
I'll take one more point for the gentleman in the front here.
Yes, I agree. You can't ban libraries. You can't ban the internet. But, David, you've got all that information there. Of what practical use is it to you? What I cannot think of any practical use for a nail bomb other than using it to commit a criminal act. And by making that information available, we are facilitating crime. And although we don't want to go back to the days of the Nazis when they had radios that could only operate in certain frequencies, we've got to do, by some way, control the information that's available.
And you think it's technically possible?
I've no idea.
Right.
David, the sick minds that make pipe bombs or make nail bombs, if they can't get the information to do one thing, they're bound to, there's the determination that they will do something evil if they're actually determined to do that. And I think the other point I would want to make is that with all that information available, there's actually one of the problems, I think, of the internet is there's so much volume of information. I share Donald and Alex's point, very difficult technically to actually control it. But there has to be, I think education is vitally important, and indeed ethical values too, so you actually can assess and evaluate information you get. There's a lot of rubbish on the internet. And therefore, I think just to have information itself is not is of limited value. You've actually got to have the education to apply to the information you get.
To this gentleman, I have a great deal of sympathy with what he says, and if it's technically possible to control things that we would control domestically, like race race hatred, race literature, anti-equality, obscenity, if that could be done, I think I'd have a lot of sympathy with his position. I'm not sure I'm prepared to pay the price of general censorship or general destruction of what is a tremendous opportunity for knowledge. So it's up to the people who are much better technically educated than you and I to try and find ways, in fact, of perhaps enforcing our domestic law or the standards that are embodied in our domestic law on that new area.
Okay, fine. Let's go on to another question. Lucy Gardner, who's a criminology student. Lucy Gardner.
Do you agree that Mr. Milosevic has been underestimated, and should NATO really cut to the chase and concentrate their efforts on removing him rather than intensifying this war?
David McCletchie.
Well, I think his resistance probably has been underestimated in the sense that I think that the initial bombardment was meant to produce an early capitulation and withdrawal of the Serbian forces, and plainly that has not happened. I do think, however, that we've got to start what we finish. We owe that to the displaced Kosovans, and although I'm not a military strategist, and I'm rather wary of armchair generals prognosticating about the correct approach in these situations, I think the NATO action has to be supported. I think we have to see it to a conclusion. And I think we have to be quite clear about what the political objectives actually are. And I think sometimes they're a bit confused. It seems to me that what you have to do is take the action necessary to ensure a withdrawal of the Serb forces, a return to the Kosovans into a safe and secure society where they will enjoy self-determination. I don't underestimate how long that's going to take.
The Conservative line in the House of Commons was that you were opposed to the use of ground troops except for peacekeeping. Is that still your position?
Well, in an ideal world, it certainly will be, and I hope the whole matter can be resolved before it gets to that stage. But and I was noted that the Foreign Secretary said the same thing in the House today, that there were no plans to deploy ground troops, and certainly we would not want ground troops to be deployed if there are other means of resolving the conflict.
Michael Portillo said today you can't do it from the cockpit of a B-52. Do you agree?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it may come to it, and if it does come to it, I think that people in Scotland and Britain will actually back the government and our NATO allies in this. I certainly do.
So you're not supporting the position William Hague took then, which was that we shall not support the use of ground troops to fight for a settlement.
No, I think the situation is changing, frankly, David, and the attitudes of all of us have to change in relation to the situation on the ground. I don't think we certainly supported that. That was certainly our position at the start, but I don't think you can be prescriptive about this situation as it evolves, frankly.
Okay. Donald Dewar, do you think, going back to the question that... sorry. Do you think that Milosevic should now... the removal of Milosevic should now be NATO's aim?
Well, I think
we know they bombed his house in Belgrade last night.
Well, what I certainly believe is that we've got to stick to the essential aim, which is to bring a degree of stability and security to the people of Kosovo. Now, they were being subjected to really appalling atrocities, deliberate and calculated series of ethnic cleansings, which I think no one in the civilized world could ignore. Now, that's common ground, I think, between all the politicians, certainly in this country and right across the NATO alliance. The question is, what could you do about it? You couldn't walk past on the other side of the street. I think that's absolutely clear. And given that,
what do you call walking past on the other side of the street?
Doing nothing.
Nothing
Doing nothing effective. Doing nothing effective. I think that's the point.
Doing nothing military.
Alec, for example, has very genuinely argued that he would rather go for an economic blockade.
So you're not accusing him of walking on the other side of the street?
Well, I don't think what he was proposing was effective, and that's the key. Because an economic blockade is going to take months and possibly years to be effective. And the one thing that is clear is the people of Kosovo didn't have time. I mean, what was happening to them meant that action had to be on a very much shorter timescale than any blockade could possibly achieve.
The question is asked whether you should go for Milosevic now.
No, I'm not interested in necessarily going for Milosevic. I'm interested in getting Milosevic. What I'm interested in is getting Milosevic and the Belgrade authorities to do what they've said they would do in the past and then reneged on. You may remember they said they would withdraw troops from Kosovo on a scale which satisfied the people with whom they were negotiating. They said they would accept much of the Rangouillet agreement, and then they didn't. And I think the aim must be, and the aim should continue to be, to ensure that they honour what they said they would do. And if they do, then we can resettle people back in Kosovo. The thick Albanian population can go back and can be re-established there. And hopefully we can get some element of stability back in a tortured and appalling situation. But it's on our doorstep, it's on our conscience. I think we were right to act.
We've got a lot of hands up. Let me go to the man in the red shirt there in the third row.
Thank you. Donald Dewar said that it was wrong to do nothing and ignore these human rights abuses. But can I point out there's an equally bloody conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, where NATO, Britain and America are doing nothing. They are not helping. There's no military action or economic blockade. So how can he defend these double standards that we see? We're concerned with Europe, but we're not so much concerned with Africa.
Is your view we shouldn't be in the Balkans, or we should be in those other places as well?
My view is that we cannot have all this high-flown rhetoric saying we must stick up for human rights around the world, but we're only concerned with what's going on in relatively our backyard in Europe.
Okay, and the man in blue with the yellow pencil there, you sir. Yes.
Yeah, Donald Dewar said that the sanctions and economic blockade would take too long. How long do you think a war would take to solve the situation?
How long will a war take? Okay. Perhaps I put that to Jim Wallace, who's a supporter of the action the government's taking.
Well, I think it is clearly taking longer to have effect than was initially anticipated. But I don't think that necessarily made the action wrong. I think that if we had sat on our hands or just proposed very ineffective action, the outcry Milosevic was actually started on ethnic cleansing before the NATO planes went in. Paddy Ashdown saw the bodies when he was out there in the autumn of last year. And indeed the ferocity and the speed with which Milosevic's troops have wreaked havoc and death and carnage in Kosovo, I think show that that must have been well planned. You couldn't actually mount an operation like that unless it had been well planned beforehand. Clearly, it is taking longer than had been expected. I think it had been an expectation that Milosevic would have come back and signed up to the agreement that was tentatively put to him at Rambouillet. But I take the view, and indeed it's a view that my party has taken, is that you cannot rule out the use of ground troops. It is something that we've said from the outset. And I think if we made a tactical error, it was giving Milosevic the signal that we weren't prepared to use ground troops at the beginning. That, in many respects, played into his hands. We cannot also allow him to have the veto over the use of ground troops. And therefore, that's why I think we've got to be prepared to use them, not simply to, as it were, enforce...
What does your enemy having a veto over what you do actually mean?
I'll explain what I mean. If we say we will only use them to enforce a peace settlement, that presupposes that he's actually got to sign up to a peace settlement. And as long as he says no to a peace settlement, we would be saying we don't use ground troops. I don't think that's a tenable position.
All right.
I'm not going to, it's not my military judgment when to send them in, but I think there's a case for sending them in.
All right. Alex Salmond, when you were the one politician, one party that stood out very clearly against this first action by NATO, and you said, I quote, "It's an action of dubious legality, but above all one of unpardonable folly." Is that still your view?
Yes, it is. And I think the last 4 weeks have borne that out. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't done for the highest of motives. I've impugned nobody's motives in this, nor shall I. And I'm sure it was the idea that something must be done. But just because something must be done is not a reason for doing the wrong thing. And I think the bombing campaign was the wrong thing. Was Milosevic underestimated? Yes, of course he was. I mean, it's all over the American papers that the Marion Albright State Department idea was 1 or 2 nights of cruise missiles and he put his hands up. That was the game plan strategy. coming from the State Department. So of course he was underestimated. Is Milosevic to blame? Of course he's to blame. But to devise a strategy to remove him, which I think we should be trying to do, you must devise a strategy that's got some sign of working. Now, the bombing campaign, certainly, of course, ethnic cleansing took place in the Balkans, and certainly the position of the Kosovo people was extreme, but it's now 100 times worse. And it's 100 times worse because in order to have the bombing campaign, we withdrew the 2,000 United Nations and Red Cross monitors, who were the only protection that these people had. That was the first thing that had to happen. So their plight is worse. Milosevic's position, as John Simpson has told us, and being traduced for doing so, has been consolidated inside Serbia. Now, what would I have done? Well, Marian Albright, again on the radio tonight, announces that she wants an oil blockade. Yes, indeed. And why have we waited 4 weeks in order to blockade Serbia's oil? Oil, the one commodity that can freeze industry, immobilize a war machine, and actually turn a civilian population against its leadership, as opposed to a bombing campaign which unfortunately has consolidated behind a gangster like Milosevic.
Okay. Bringing a number of people now. You said.
We were well aware of the ethnic cleansing prior to NATO's intervention. Why was there no contingency plan to deal with the anticipated stuff that was going to happen after the bombing? What about all the ethnic Albanians now? What's the contingency plan for them? As Alex Salmond said, they've pulled out all the UN. There's nothing for them.
Were you in favour of the action or not?
I wasn't, no.
No. And you say on the fourth row there.
Yes, presumably there is intelligence that said Milosevic would probably not submit. How long are we going to wait? Are we going to wait until Kosovo only has Serbians there before we take further action?
You think there should be military action on the ground?
I think it's inevitable that we will have to do that.
All right. The woman in the centre here. Yes.
I'm wondering, since the NATO allies underestimated Milosevic's determination not to give in to the bombs, are they also going to underestimate his determination not to give in to ground troops? Might we not find that instead of the Serbian army running, screaming to their mammies as soon as a nice NATO army comes along, might they not stand and fight instead? And we find we've not enough troops, not enough armour, and in the end we're going to have a long, long war with conscription and all the rest of it. Remember, the First World War, which started in August 1914, was supposed to be over by Christmas 1914, and it took 4 years.
We're hearing a good deal of scepticism about NATO's action. Donald Dewar, do you want to respond to what you've heard and what Alex Salmond said?
Well, I don't think I don't think anyone thought this was going to be easy. I think, on the other hand, to draw comparisons with the First World War don't help the reality of the debate, and I really don't. I would advise very strongly against that. But what is clear is that we had to put on very strong pressure. The bombing strikes were a way of doing that. In a sense, as you know, one of the targets has been the oil supplies, the oil dumps, and the infrastructure of the country. The fact that President Milosevic has dug in and refused to budge in the face of that suggests to me that an oil blockade, which, as I say, inevitably would take many, many months, probably more than many months, is in fact a suggestion that it would have been very ineffective indeed.
But what do you say to the point the man there made, that what actually happened you were neither prepared for nor anticipated?
Well,
that was the consequence
what
of
was happening.
Incompetence
I think,
in your government's part.
Well,
it was incompetence. That's what it was.
Well, I'm not.
You didn't have it planned out, Donald.
Well,
it wasn't planned out.
Well, as you've just said to me that you're against military action and you're against bombing, I'm not quite sure what kind of forward planning
I'm against your government's planning and method of intervention without thinking and following it through properly and planning it. I mean, what kind of government have we got that can't think and plan properly?
Well, I really think your position is remarkably confused, because what you seem to be saying, well, let me just explain to you. What you seem to be saying to me is that you're against any form of military action, but you're criticising the government because they didn't have military plans advanced. What we were doing was carrying out a whole series of diplomatic initiatives through the United Nations. Well, we were negotiating in a way at Rambouillet, and in the talks we were putting on pressure, we were mobilising world opinion, and of course you've got to remember that the action has been agreed by a whole range of countries right across the NATO alliance.
But it hasn't worked, Donald. It hasn't worked.
Well,
it's obvious.
All right, hold on. This argument will go on for a bit. Let me bring in one or two more people there. The woman in the third row there. You, madam, yes.
Yeah. Will the decision of whether or not we send in ground troops be taken by Tony Blair? This is a question for Donald Dewar.
They can't all go to him.
Or will it be subject to parliamentary debate?
Well, there's already been very considerable parliamentary debate.
You haven't had a debate on whether you should be there or not, have you?
Well, we've had a whole series of exchanges and debates.
You've had exchanges, you haven't taken a vote.
Well,
you haven't.
All right, no one called a vote. I mean, let's get that quite clear. So I really think that's a rather a non-point. What I would say to you, well, it is a non-point because it suggests there was some way in which people were being stopped. But let me just make it clear to you that if any decision to take in ground troops is made, it will obviously have to be debated. It will obviously be very widely discussed. It will be a NATO decision taken by all the countries in the NATO alliance, and it will need to have that strength. This isn't a one-man crusade. This is a matter of international indignation at atrocities carried out against an innocent civilian population, an ethnic cleansing of the worst sort. And let's not forget that when we're looking at what is happening.
I want to ask now, because we've had a lot of scepticism about NATO, which Donald Dewar has replied. I want to hear people who disagree with Alex Salmond's position, who in other words are in favour of what NATO is doing. Could I hear from one or two people who think that? You in the third row here.
As a reservist in the Royal Navy, I object to Alex Salmond's opinion because I could be asked to go and fight for my country without, for the first time in history, the whole active support of the Commons. Why should I do that when I don't have the support of my country behind me, be asked to risk my life like this?
So you think all parties should be together on this issue?
Yes, I do.
Right. And hold on, let me just, and you, sir, in the blue shirt there.
Yeah, a similar point. I'm surprised that Alex Salmond has no regrets about the statement that he made in public through a broadcast some 3 weeks ago now, in the light of the fact that his comments were used after that as part of President Milosevic's propaganda campaign. Something else, a further point, if he had made his points privately to the government, he then couldn't have been accused of electioneering as he was, and perhaps then the SNP's poll ratings wouldn't have slumped as they have in the past 3 weeks.
Right. Let him answer.
Well, can I say to you that I'm not a fool politically. I didn't have any expectation that the remarks I made would be popular. It was absolutely nothing to do with the election campaign. I made these remarks because I believed them to be true. I spoke my mind out because I thought I had a responsibility to do so. Now, in answer to the lady's point, I do support our armed forces, whether on the air or on the ground in the future. But the politicians who make the decisions cannot be above criticism. And people have a duty and an obligation, especially on matters like this, to tell the truth as they see it. And that applies to John Simpson, it applies to the Labour MPs on Monday who spoke in the same direction as myself, and the Tory MPs who said the same thing. If we don't have that ability to speak our minds out, to say what we think, then what on earth are we fighting for if it's not that sort of democratic value?
Alec, of course you have the right to speak your mind, and of course you have the right to express a view, even if it's an unpopular view. But you know, on 4 or 5 occasions in the House of Commons, before you made your broadcast, either you did not express a view that this was about to be unpardonable folly. It's a very serious allegation, which you never took the opportunity. Not just that, the SNP didn't even speak at all in the debate that took place immediately after the bombing started. And I think the charge you have yet to acquit yourself of is why it took you so long, why you didn't use the forum of Parliament, like people like Tony Benn and Tam Dalyell did, to express their misgivings, and why you waited until after the event to criticise.
Okay. Can I answer the point that well, I asked the Prime Minister a question, and I asked him a question about ground troops. I couldn't actually believe if he was going to commit to an air campaign, he was going to rule out ground troops. I think that was an error of very substantial proportions. And Jim, I'm surprised that you're not knowing what my position was before the broadcast, because 4 weeks ago we appeared in this very city in front of an audience of 6... Sorry, Jim, let me finish.
Why didn't you take the opportunity in Parliament to make your position?
No, Jim, you asked me a question.
Well, if you knew his position, why didn't you say what his position was for him? If you thought it was so important, it was after
the debates.
4 weeks ago, 4 weeks, I'll tell you what I'm about to say, Jim, okay? 4 weeks ago, in this very city, in front of 600 people, 4 days before the broadcast, I said exactly the same thing, and I said it then because I believe it. I still believe it now, and I will still say
you can't get away with that, because I've got two witnesses who were there, and that is not what you said. You did not describe it as unpardonable.
No, you certainly did not.
And even then, even on that occasion, you still had a
listen. We now no, you can't. We now know his view, and let's stop arguing about when he did or should or shouldn't have said it. Let's bring in David McCletchie, who's been silent for a bit. Do you have a comment on what Alex Salmond said, on the substance of it? Let's get back to the issue.
Yes, well, I don't deny Alex's right to express his view in the matter. I think it caused a great deal of offence among people in Scotland. I think his language was unfortunate, and it seems to be giving aid and comfort to Milosevic. I know that that's not his intention, but unfortunately that has been the outcome of the comments that you've made, Alec. I mean, everybody's out of step about your jock as far as you're concerned, at a time when we should be getting behind our armed forces and supporting our allies.
Quite a few members of the audience share my opinion, David.
Ian,
just a question.
Ian, I want another question from... I want another question on the same subject from Ian Nichols, who is retired. Ian Nichols.
In the light of the events in the Balkans, is not nationalism an outdated concept?
I suppose you should answer that, Alexander.
Well, I think it's a very strange thing to say. I mean, you might argue that the people of Kosovo are arguing for independence. Certainly some of the representatives are, and that may be the agenda that's in future perceived. I think there's a big difference. Firstly, I don't think, given in Scotland, for example, that we, in the course of this century, haven't had a single person even seriously injured arguing for or against Scottish independence, then I don't think it's really appropriate to compare the debate we're having in Scotland with what we see in the Balkans.
In what sense do you, in what sense do you think it's outdated and dangerous, sir?
Over the years, we've seen nationalists arising in many countries, and it usually leads to bloodshed. Not always, but usually.
Okay. Well, I think therefore we should be very proud of the democratic record we have in Scotland in favour of enunciating that argument and perhaps I think there's a big difference between those who have independence but seek to dominate other people and those who are aspiring for national liberation in their own country. I think there's a very substantial difference. I think Mr. Milosevic is in the former, and other people throughout the world are in the latter and should be proud to do so.
Donald Dewar.
Well, I certainly don't see any embryo professor, what am I talking about? President Milosevic. President Milosevic is in Scotland at the moment, and therefore I wouldn't pursue that analogy or pursue that comparison.
You make no connection.
My objection to the position that Alex Salmond argues is an objection to its impact upon Scotland, and upon the fact that I don't believe the majority of Scots want to cut relations with the rest of the United Kingdom. I think that we have a very substantial common interest, but we need a new arrangement within the United Kingdom that gives a stronger voice to Scotland, which trusts people not just in Scotland but in other parts of the United Kingdom to take decisions that affect their lives. And I'm very proud of the fact that I'm a member of a government that has done more to pass power from the centre to the people than any other government in the last 200 or 300 years. And, well, indeed, Alec, and I just read the other day an article. I just read an article which you wrote for the Federation of Small Businesses the other week. A thousand words, Alec, in which you praise greatly the devolution settlement and don't mention the word independence once. And I think that's highly significant.
All right, we're going on to Scottish affairs, but just on this point, are you a Scottish nationalist yourself? Would you call yourself a Scottish nationalist?
I certainly wouldn't call it with a capital S and a capital N. I can tell you that for nothing.
Small S and big N?
I'm very proud of being a Scot. I'm very proud of the environment in which I've been brought up. It's marked and shaped me. I'm proud of Scotland's cultural traditions and our contribution to the United Kingdom. I believe that we are going to have a powerful parliament governing our domestic affairs while retaining the links that are sensible with the rest of the country. Okay. The polls suggest, and I think public opinion and the feeling in the streets suggests, that is what Scotland wants.
All right, well, we're coming on to Scotland, so let's...
on the wall. Well, no, in relation to this, but yes. Right. You know, in a curious sort of way, Alex Salmond actually thinks nationalism is an outdated concept because the SNP's policy is independence in Europe, which frankly means dependence on Europe, and turning Scotland into a region of a larger country called Europe.
All right. Jim Wallace, very, very briefly, because we're going on to this business about Scottish nationalism and independence.
I certainly think the parallels between the kind of nationalism we've seen in the Balkans and the nationalism of Alec's party are very wrong indeed. I mean, Alec's party has argued its case through the ballot box. It won't succeed in getting independence through the ballot box because the majority of people don't want independence. But I think the kind of nationalism that's healthy is the kind of nationalism we saw when actually Wales got that final conversion and Scotland won the Five Nations Trophy.
All right, we must move on because we haven't got 2 hours, only one tonight. Before I take another question, if you'd like to take part in question time, join our audience. Next week we're going to be in London. After that we're going to be in Birmingham, and then we're going to be in Belfast. And if you would like to join in any of those programmes, do give us a call. There's the number, 0894 114411. Alternatively, you can try getting through to us via our website, where you won't find anything that you shouldn't. And we look forward to seeing you in the audience. Let's go on to another question. This from James Barrowman, who's a student.
Yeah, in view of the recent high costings of independence, shouldn't the SNP be telling us about the Scottish sixpence rather than the Scottish penny?
This was the report that came out yesterday, I think, suggesting that an independent Scotland would cost 1.8 billion a year and would mean sixpence on income tax. Forget the 1 penny here or there between 23 and 22. David McCletchie.
Well, yes, they should. I mean, I think the report shows there is a sustained £7 billion deficit in the Scottish economy, which can't be bridged. And the agenda that the SNP pursues for the Scottish economy is a high tax, high spend, big government policy, which frankly would lead to lower employment in Scotland and lower public services. So I endorse the report. And I wholeheartedly support the concept of Scotland remaining a partner in the United Kingdom, one of the most successful economic, political and monetary unions the world has ever known, and which has been a great stage on which Scots have prospered for generations.
Yes. I don't want to be offensive, but if you could all avoid the generalisations and get into the specifics, it would help us. What's your position on the tax, then, on a penny on the tax? 23 and 22.
We've made it absolutely clear in this election that we want no new taxes on Scots, whether that's the so-called tartan tax or Alec's so-called penny for Scotland, whether it's extra business rates, giving rate-setting powers back to Labour's discredited councils, whether it's tolls to drive on roads that people have already paid for their taxes, or tolls to come into cities. We want a parliament that lives within its means, which is the block grant allocation that we get from the Treasury, and within that we feel that we can fulfil our programme.
James Barrowman, what do you think?
Well, personally, I think that Scotland should remain part of the Union. I really don't think Scots are willing to pay the price in terms of the sixpence taxation. I don't think they're willing to pay the price in terms of being free from the Union. I also find it quite odd that the SNP's position is independence within Europe, while a £1.8 billion deficit will mean we can't actually take part in EMU. I think there's a discrepancy in the SNP's figures there, and I think it's something they've failed to address throughout this campaign.
Alex Salmond?
Well, let's see if we can address it now, shall we? I mean, I don't think there's any surprise about the report today. I mean, Professor Donald Mackay doesn't even believe in devolution, never mind independence, and he makes that very clear in his report. Presumably, you don't agree with that bit of his report. What was a surprise in this campaign is that the David Hume Institute, a highly respected institute, gave an extremely favourable report on independence and the prospects for independence. Well, you're scoffing, Donald. I mean, among the contributors... Well, let me finish my point.
Yes.
Among the contributors was a former senior economic advisor to the Department of Trade and Industry. I'm really surprised at your position, David. You seem to have reversed it in 24 hours, because yesterday you were quoted as saying if independence was to be judged in money terms, you might as well hand the prize to Alex Salmond.
No, sorry, that's a gross misrepresentation.
Well, that's what the press do.
Gross misrepresentation of the
Even more so.
Was there a knot missing? Or what?
No, it's a gross misrepresentation. What I was simply saying was... Yeah, but that doesn't take the whole context of what I was saying. The important thing I was saying was that you do not judge the value of the union in simply economic terms, and you cannot float off independence simply on the basis of 1 year's figures. You don't opt in out of the union because oil prices might have trebled or quadrupled.
But you
don't
asked the question. That is a judgment you would make, isn't it?
All the information is the union is good for Scotland.
The financial judgment is one that you would make.
I think prima facie, I would imagine an independent Scotland would be more expensive at first glance, yeah.
Right, okay, well, I don't judge independence just in economic terms either, but if David wanted to make an economic point in his quotation, I think I'm entitled to cite it against him, given it was only 24 hours ago, David.
Okay, let's get back to the point about you were rubbishing one report and praising another.
I was going to cite another, since we're floating experts at each other, prima facie, as the gentleman says. Andrew Hughes Hallett, a professor in this city, in the University of Strathclyde, advised 7 of the governments who are now within the European monetary system, has said quite clearly in a report published a few weeks ago that Scotland would meet all of the criteria for entrance to the Maastricht criteria, including that of budget deficit. So I don't think when we've got that weight of economic evidence in favour of an independent Scotland, that prima facie or otherwise, you should have any doubts. We should judge it on the whole, and economically Scotland's a very good bet indeed.
The man in the second row.
Is the negative campaigning and scaremongering not why people are getting turned off here? What do we believe about Scotland? Do we believe that we're dumber than the Danes, that we're not as bright as the Norwegians? We can't run our affairs. It's a choice, fair enough. There's an argument to be made for a united kingdom, there's an argument to be made for devolution, there's an argument to be made for independence. Can we not fight it on positive grounds? Instead of this scaremongering thing, you'd never be able to do it. Because we would be able to do it. And it's a choice, a free choice, we should be able to make on the tax basis. Is it not a fault of the Scotland Act that the only ability to vary tax is on basic rates and not on total tax take, which would allow us to target it properly, put in a properly progressive tax and tax the rich?
Donald,
Well, can I say to this gentleman that I agree with his basic point that we ought to have a free choice and we ought to debate this openly. I mean, I had a very interesting conversation with a man in Union Street, Aberdeen the other day, and I parted with him on the best of terms because he was going to vote for the SNP. He said to me, look, I'm a nationalist. I don't mind if it brings pain. I accept there'll be pain. But I'm prepared to bear that pain. Now let me just make that.
It was his dentist.
No, let me then just give. Let me give you no, it's an actual conversation, and let me give you an example of what I mean. I was camping in East Kilbride the other day, and someone said to me, "I work in Abercrombie House, where there are 550 jobs, which are the International Development Department's office in Scotland." And he said, "Can you give me a guarantee that they will continue?" The answer is yes, we can. But we can't if the nationalists win. I've got constituents working in Kentigern House in Glasgow, 700 jobs, the Army Personnel Centre. What happens to their jobs after independence? Now, it may be worth paying the pain, but bearing the pain, but there is a downside. And what's very interesting
he
is
says
that,
there isn't pain.
Well, let me just say,
I'm
giving him 2 examples of very real pain. And it's quite interesting that we were waiting. In fact, I will quote an impeccable authority, which is the Scottish National Party's manifesto for this election. They said they would be publishing an economic strategy for independence. It hasn't appeared yet. In the very article about Hughes Hallett, which Alec was mentioning, I think Andrew Wilson at the end of it accepted that there would be a fiscal deficit, a gap between income and revenue in an independent Scotland. That's the view, certainly, of Gavin McCrone, of the Fraser Van der Institute, of Professor Arthur Midwinter.
You're a clever man.
How nice of you. How nice of you to mention that fact.
Just stop citing all these sources. What's your view?
Well, no, what I'm saying, I'm giving you 2 very good examples of job losses that will almost certainly follow. And what I'm saying to you is that there is an enormous silence about the economic strategy for independence from the nationalists.
And you believe, Scott, you believe this report, that it costs 6pence in the pound?
No, what I'm saying is that there's quite clearly a fiscal deficit. There's a gap between the revenue and the expenditure of a Scotland independent. Now, you can, of course, bridge that gap. You can bridge that gap. You can bridge it by raising taxes or by cutting public spending. But you can't just magic it away in the way that is being suggested. And can I say to Alec, really, to rubbish the Pider report because you don't like Donald Mackay's politics.
You
I could.
hold on, look,
I could.
Scottish
Well, could I?
enterprise.
Could I?
This
Could
is-
I?
this is-
Could I?
People are listening to this programme.
Well,
People are listening to this programme outside
but-
Scotland, and they don't know who you're talking about.
But listen, could you not just say that it might have been just honest if that was going to be the criteria to mention the main man on the David Hume report was an ex-Scottish National Party parliamentary candidate?
Jim Wallace. Jim Wallace, save us from this for a moment.
The gentleman there was making comparisons with other nations. The question at the end of the day is not whether Scotland could stand on its own 2 feet or not. The question is, what is the cost of doing so? And are there other costs which are not necessarily quantified in money terms? And I believe there would be a serious cost in doing so. There are all the costs, the fact that there is a deficit, in fact that the money which Scotland receives from the United Kingdom pool as a whole is greater than the income and the various revenues, taxes that we put into it. That would be a cost. There would be a cost in setting up our own social security systems, disentangling pension systems, having our own separate armed forces, having our own separate embassies. These are all, I believe, unnecessary costs. I'm a proud Scot, but I don't feel I need to have an independent army, navy and air force to prove it. And then there's the other costs. There's the costs to business. The cost, but England is still our major export destination. I mean, actually, to be fair to Alec, we would actually quite considerably increase our exports because England would become a foreign country. But that, I don't think, would actually be helpful. What's the nationalist view on where the currency would be? Would we have separate currency from sterling? And if so, what would the transaction costs be to Scottish business? And if we didn't have a separate currency from sterling, then in fact, actually, monetary power pegged to the pound, the actual power would still live in London, and we would have no say over it at all. There is a cost to be paid, and people should be aware of what these costs are.
No, hold on, wait a minute. I want to bring 1 or 2 more people, and I want to take another question. You, sir, in green.
Yes, it seems to me that ever since Margaret Thatcher's sermon on the Mound, when she tried to convince the Church of Scotland that the love of money was not indeed the root of all evil, that there's been a difference of opinion between what people in the south of England feel about money and what we feel here. The Tory party carried on very successfully this attack, but just before the Parliament was decided upon, and now the Labour Party are just carrying this argument on. It seems to me...
So what do you mean by a difference in what people think about money in the south of England and what they think in Scotland?
We have been verbally attacked with regards to nothing but money. 90% of the unionist argument has to do with money. Independence is a great deal more than that.
There is more to it than money. I think there's a shared heritage, there's a shared culture. There's the fact there's the kinship that exists within these islands, and I wouldn't want to throw that away.
That might be right, Jim, but I've been listening to the 3 of them, and it's like a replay of that dreadful party political broadcast from the Labour Party last week. You know, that grainy one in black and white to scare the children. I mean, it's a good job. It's a good job.
It
didn't scare me, Don.
Well, it wasn't seen.
It's a good job.
Most of our viewers didn't see it, so let's get off that onto something else.
Lucky for them, that's what I would say. But Donald, I'm going to have a turn about defending the economics and the potential
be
of
brief
Scotland.
about it, because I've got another question I want to bring.
Well, it's a good job that these 3 weren't politicians in Denmark, Luxembourg or Ireland or any of the other highly successful independent states. And the argument that Scotland couldn't emulate that success is a demeaning argument which really is very poor in this political debate.
Okay, right, this is a question which could have come from the south of England, from Croydon, but it doesn't. It comes from here. Charles Dundas, who's a student.
With all the money being spent these days on think tanks and spin doctors, has anyone ever got round to answering the West Lothian question?
The West Lothian question being, for anybody who still doesn't know, what happens when you have your Parliament in Scotland deciding all sorts of things for Scotland, and Scottish MPs unable to decide those things up here, but deciding them for the rest of the United Kingdom, which the rest of the United Kingdom might jib at, particularly if it was a close vote. David McCletchie.
Well, no one has, but I do think that that's something that should be done. We are going to have a reduction in the number of Scottish MPs in the House of Commons the election after next because of changes in the Boundary Commission rules. I think most people in Scotland, having our own Parliament, do think it's anomalous that Scottish MPs in the House of Commons will be able to vote on matters relating to education and health and housing. Well, I think it's personally.
You can't do much, of course. You haven't got much power.
Well, we're not in the government at the moment, but in a couple of years' time, we'll correct that, David. Thank you, Donald. I'm glad it gives you such great pleasure to be back in opposition, your natural home.
What's the answer to this?
Well, I think
it goes to the root of devolution.
It does indeed go to the root of devolution. I think, in a sense, the English have to answer the question rather than the Scots being prescriptive. But one of the answers might be to adjust the voting rights of Scottish MPs so that they don't vote on matters relating to health, education and housing in Scotland. I personally think that would be quite fair.
So you could have, so to speak, a Labour government in Westminster that could win its way on certain subjects, but would lose because their members wouldn't be allowed to vote on other subjects.
Yes, well, they just have to be grown up and accept that. That's the consequences of, effectively, of devolution and the way it works out in the country as a whole.
What's the Labour government proposing to do about it? And
well, can I
it's
say
not beyond possibility that it becomes a thorn in the flesh, in the political flesh.
Well, what we have done...
Not just MDL, but other people.
I would never refer to him as a thorn in the political flesh. I might say many things about my old colleague and friend, but not that. Let me just make it clear that I don't see anything threatening in the present situation. What the government put to Parliament, and which Parliament passed by an overwhelming majority, was that we should recognise the fact that in Scotland for 300 years we have had a whole body of separate legislation reflecting our separate approach in education and health and housing and a number of other areas. That this was separate because of that difference, a difference worth preserving because no one wanted to abolish it. And that in the interest of democracy, we should pass that to a directly elected body in Scotland in order to have that body reflecting directly Scottish opinions and coming up with solutions that are built in Scotland for the particular Scottish set of circumstances. The advantage of that is it enriches democracy, it strengthens democracy, and it ends forever the kind of insensitivity and the difficulties which we saw over the last 18 years or so, and which are perhaps typified most strongly in the imposition of the poll tax on Scotland.
So it won't be a problem for the rest of the United Kingdom?
Well, I don't think it will be a problem, unless I'll tell you something, David. There was a very good debate on this subject, and a well-known Tory grandee stood up and said, it's all a terrible disgrace. It's the end of democracy as we know it. And then he said, the trouble is, he said, that none of my constituents are worried about it. But I want to try and do something about that.
Yeah.
Now, I don't.
But of course, you don't have a Scottish Parliament yet. In 2 weeks' time, you will, and maybe they will start at that point.
No, well, I hope not.
The man in the third row.
I think it's another good example of Labour not having thought through the consequences of devolution. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I think it's going to be good to see the friction between Holyrood and Westminster, but I don't know if it's going to be good for Scotland.
You think there'll be horns locked?
Yeah.
Jim Wallace.
Well, I think the fact, as Donald's alluded to, the fact that things like the poll tax imposed against Scotland against the will of the majority of Scottish MPs, opt-out schools, nursery vouchers, all the things, many things that happened under the Tory regime, I think fueled the case for a Scottish Parliament. There always was a good case. And therefore I don't think we can ignore the question that Charles Dundas asked, because I think if it did come to the bit where Scottish MPs were actually making the difference on legislation imposed on England, that would actually fuel some resentment there and actually would threaten or could threaten the United Kingdom. But, you know, in my own party, we haven't actually needed spin doctors or think tanks. For many years, we've backed a federal solution for the United Kingdom, which Scotland would have its parliament, Wales have its assembly, Northern Ireland have its assembly. It's up to the English. I'm not going to prescribe for the English whether they have regional assemblies or an English parliament. But I believe that is the logical destination of where we've started, and what we've achieved in terms of the Scottish Parliament is a very significant and useful and a very welcome way down that road.
All right. You, sir, in the third row. Yes.
I think the gentleman there was absolutely right. This is a question which really asks fundamental questions about the nature of this uneasy compromise that is devolution. And another one which perhaps Donald can answer now is, if a second chamber is such a vital and necessary facet of a working democracy, why are the government so confident that a Scottish Parliament does not need to work under the supervision of one? Now, ladies and gentlemen, there are only two possible answers to this. The first
You're
one...
going to give them, though. He's not allowed to answer.
Hopefully we'll finally get an answer from politicians this week. The first answer is that the Westminster doesn't see the Scottish Parliament as having enough powers to merit one, in which case that's a betrayal of the people who wanted power moved north of the border. Or the only other possible answer is that Westminster isn't willing to give Scotland the facilities which it needs in order to work in a
Now, hold on, let's go. I want to come... Alex Salmond, the West Lothian question is easy for you because you want an independent Scotland. Well, do you think the West Lothian question is going to be one of the sores, S-O-R-E, that devolution creates?
Well, I mean, you're right about that, but I was once asked the difference between the West Lothian question and the Slavic Holstein question. And the difference is that in the case of the West Lothian question, the only 3 people ever understood it. One's mad, one's dead. But in West Lothian, Tamdale has not forgotten. That's now, I've, as David rightly said, got the solution to this. I mean, I think there should be 0 Scottish MPs at Westminster, and I think the people of England should be self-governing. And I know some people doubt that England could sustain itself as an independent country, but I've got no doubts. I've got no doubts at all. I know they can do it. In terms of what happens in Scotland. Now, Donald says we'll be able to do things on our own. I just wonder about that, because if you look at the Labour policy in this election, I just wonder how much of it is still controlled from Millbank in London. And I give you one example, tuition fees. I'm absolutely certain from all the soundings I've got that a majority of Labour supporters in Scotland are deeply opposed to tuition fees. So why is the imposition of tuition fees still in the Labour Party manifesto if the strings are still not being pulled from London?
Okay. I'll let you answer about strings and men, but the man in the second row of the back over there.
It's important to remember that the proposed solution of lessening Scottish MPs' voting rights on matters of English budgetary considerations isn't actually effective because of the nature of the block grant. Scotland's funding allocation is provided on a ratio related to whole UK spending. So if Scots MPs didn't have the right to vote on that, then the English MPs could effectively control spending in Scotland by reducing that ratio.
But I mean, as long as there's a Labour government in Westminster and Labour, and if there's a Labour administration, government in Scotland. Yes. Administration.
Well, this is a system that's built actually to
well,
cope with.
If Labour's in power in both places, what he's saying is that the strings will be pulled from London.
Yes, but it's a total fallacy to judge this on the basis of that there is going to be the same administration in both parliaments. There may be different colours of political administration, and I think the important thing is, this man is wonderful to have an optimist.
I'm bubbling with optimism.
I don't think you bubble at all, David, but I believe it. Look, let's get this clear for a start. The West Lothian question is not unprecedented. That's the first point to make. There have been precedents for this. And as I repeat, I think it is a simple matter of a democratic case and a strongly democratic case. What we've done is we've answered the wishes of Scotland, and by showing that the United Kingdom is flexible enough to accommodate those wishes, I think we've strengthened the Union. And let's not get any doubt of it. Look at the majority in the referendum. Look at the majorities on all these issues which you are tested by the public opinion polls. There's no doubt that there is strong support. Even David McCletchie, who I'm sure fought hard as he could against devolution, is now saying it must be made to work. Absolutely. And in fact, his rather unlikely and implausible stance is he is more faithful to devolution even than I am.
All right. Yes. I'm going to bring in the man in the front row here. He's been trying to speak on a number of questions. Hold on, no, I won't let you. I'm sorry.
Last year, Tony Blair described the Scottish Parliament as nothing more than a glorified parish council. I think, in light of that, we need to retain our full number of MPs at Westminster.
Well, first of all, we are retaining our full number of MPs at Westminster. The decision in the Scotland Act, the law of the land, is that the boundary commissioners will treat Scotland in terms of representation at Westminster exactly as any other part of the United Kingdom. Before that, there was an article.
We're coming to the end of our time, but you are going to keep the same number of MPs. No question changed.
The problem, Donald, is it's not the deduction of Westminster. It's the reduction of Scottish MPs as a consequence of what's happening in Westminster. Is that not Westminster pulling the strings?
We had an artificial situation in which we had a boosted representation because of the additional Scottish business. That business now goes to the Scottish Parliament, which what the vast majority of Scots want, and will be treated in exactly the same way as the other parts of the United Kingdom.
The guillotine is falling on you.
Let me just say, Mr. Salmond once said we would never deliver. We have delivered. That is why there is optimism about Scottish politics, and I'm delighted if he gives me an apology.
As they say, this will go on and on and on, but we have to end the programme because that's all we've got time for tonight. My thanks to our audience here in Glasgow, to all of you on the panel. We're in London, as I said, next week, and our guests will include Michael Heseltine, Charles Kennedy for the Liberal Democrats, and Charles Moore, editor of the Daily Telegraph, and Jack Cunningham for Labour. Viewers in Scotland, though, will have their own special programme to continue these debates about the election. So, for those of you who'll be watching us, until next Thursday, good night.
And Question Time returns in 3 weeks' time. Back to this evening, and there's discussion from the Dispatch Box over on BBC Two Now with Anne Mackenzie.